We are good to go, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Let's call a meeting in order of the Public Works and Utilities Committee. Meeting, Councilman Seekins, give us a few words, please. Councilman Seekins out there?
Maybe
I
muted.
am, Mr. Chairman. I had to go through about 4 toggles to get to unmute. If you all don't mind, let's just take a moment of silence, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's entertain a motion to approve the minutes of December 16th, 2024. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Probably moving second. Any question on those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Acceptance and dedication of rights of way, Central Park Cluster Development. Who's going to address that? Is
Well,
anybody? Okay, here you
I
go.
can try to give it a shot, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
Let's see. It looks like the item E is the Central Park Cluster Development. So these are the road right-of-ways within the Central Park Cluster, which is a residential neighborhood on James Island, just north of Central Park Road.
Okay. All right, there's a motion.
Move for approval.
Second.
Probably moving second. And any questions on that? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Doesn't look like anything unusual about these temporary encroachments, Mr. Fountain.
I am not aware of anything unusual on those either, Mr. Chairman.
All right, let's use for information only. No public service updates. Item H1, Barberry Woods, Mr. Fountain.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Share my screen very briefly. Oh, briefly for the first item. So the Barbary Woods item 1 is approval of Amendment 8. So this is the professional services contract with WK Dixon, who was the design engineer, both for this project as well as some grant funded work we did with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for sort of the totality of Johns Island. This is an amendment to add in, now that we have a construction contract, the construction engineering and inspection services. Again, at council, we approved the low bid construction contract of just over 5.8 million. This construction engineering inspection contract, $398,050.
Any questions from committee members? We have a motion.
Move for approval.
Second.
Probably moving second. Any more discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you. H2, Barberry Woods again.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is just notification of the committee that we're working through finalizing our quotes and going through the city process for the wetland and stream mitigation credits. We received our United States Army Corps of Engineer individual permit for the project, and that gives us our final number of mitigation credits to purchase for stream and wetland mitigation. This is budgeted within the project. The quotes we've been getting have been ranging between about the high end of the 500s up to about 900, depending on availability. You're only allowed to buy credits within a certain geographic area, so you're restricted on which banks you can use. We do think we have a good final offer and agreement on the lower end of this, so well within our budget. That's coming through the internal city processes now, and likely will come to council before we have another Public Works Utilities agenda. So I just wanted to make sure the committee was aware of it, and if there were any questions, I could address them before it came to Ways and Means.
Questions from committee members? I don't see any hands. So is this for information, Mr. Fountain?
This is for information at this point, Mr. Chairman. We don't have a final contract yet, but we are finalizing it with the legal department at the moment. We did get some very good pricing, so we're feeling good about it.
Well, that's good news. H3, Concord Street Pump Station Upfit.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is just an update on one of our major capital projects. This project, you probably remember, is the Concord Pump Station, which services both the newer Market Street connections into the pump station, the deep tunnel system, as well as the original deep tunnel system for the peninsula that runs down Calhoun Street from the aquarium, turns and then goes up Meeting Street to the visitor center. That system's an interesting one in that it doesn't disconnect that whole corridor from the surface drainage system. It basically adds additional service points at some of the lowest areas that hold water. So you'll still see some temporary street flooding sometimes, but it will drain out in those low points from this pump station being added. That pump station was built about 2000. So we're more than 20 years old, almost 25 years old now, hit the end of its service life, having some reliability challenges, very hard to find parts. We went through a CMAR process, had a contractor, Ruby Collins, who started to work on this last year. We did our first phase of work, paused for hurricane season to make sure we had full functionality of the pump station through hurricane season. And now we've picked up the second phase of work, which is scheduled to complete again prior to this hurricane season with a fully upfitted pump station. So far, we've done roof replacement, which I'll show you some pictures of, with a BAR approved hand crimped copper roof. Looks great, supposed to have a very long service life. We're currently working through pump replacement in addition to VFDs, trying to bring down the wear and tear in the pumps. Completely replacing all the electrical equipment. The current equipment is basically old enough that you basically can't find parts for it anymore or get it serviced. So we have a series of vendors who do good work with it, but we're replacing all of that, bringing it up to modern standards. And again, we're keeping all of it in operation. Even now, while we're working, 2 of the 4 pumps continue to operate in case there is a rainstorm or another issue. This is the site. You can see it's a very tight site located next to the IAM. Which keeps our contractor on their toes. Here's a nice picture of the roof replacement. So the old roof that was starting to fail, which is also a copper roof at the time, being replaced, new copper roof, which will age itself and oxidize back into that more traditional look of copper that we expect to see.
Wait, if I could ask a question.
Yes.
A 30-year-old copper roof has failed?
Yes, I think basically there's enough sailing environment right next to the ocean there that it basically has been deteriorated to the point where the architect said it had to be replaced realistically. And since we're out there doing work on the project anyway, this is the most opportune time we're ever going to get with cranes on site to replace it.
Okay, I mean,
I'm sorry,
should last. A decent gauge copper should last a hell of a lot longer than that, but anyway.
Yeah, no, and Steve just reminded me by text literally that the original was tin, the new one is copper. That's why the different coloration. So the original was tin, hence the 30-year lifespan. The new one is copper, which should take us to a 50-year lifespan is what they're estimating. Yeah, good question, Mr. Mayor. Pump station. So we're trying to, again, we're upfitting, we're trying to reuse as much of the existing equipment as possible. You can see some of the pump housings on the left basically have been taken out, sandblasted, reprimed, and are being reinstalled so that we can reuse the existing equipment. Contractor's doing a great job, again, upfitting everything so that it doesn't deteriorate to the point where it fails. Much cheaper than replacement. And then some pictures just of the new pumps. If you're paying really careful attention, you'll notice that this construction site is the Spring Fishburne construction site. Same contractor doing both projects. They're storing all of the equipment at the Spring Fishburne site because the IAM, the Concord Street site, is so tight they can't fit the equipment on site. So they shuttle it back and forth as they're ready to install it. Down below, mostly for Councilman Gregg's entertainment, some VFDs, electrical cabinets. Again, most electrical equipment in cabinet just looks like large steel and aluminum cabinets, but everything is getting replaced and upfit. And it's always a little exciting. You got to keep the old stuff in while you're switching into the new stuff because we're still running pumps. But it's been a good project. Contractors doing a great job on schedule, on budget. Very good experience with the CMAR contractor so far. that's just a brief update now. We'll be continuing to work on that for the next 4 or 5 months, and then it should be fully operational again for hurricane season.
Did we lose our chairman?
I think we did.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, good job, Mr.
I would like to say that was the exciting part of the agenda with a lot of pictures. It's going to get worse on the next item.
Keep going. You're on a roll. We authorize you by committee. Just keep on going.
Okay, I will. There's no vote necessary for that item. It's just for information. So I'll switch over to the stormwater manual revisions, which are a little more complex and spreadsheet-like. So the department has been looking at the Stormwater Design Standards Manual. We passed this, many of you probably recall, back in 2020. We did a major revision after a couple of year-long stakeholder process, which was a very, very significant shift to how we regulated stormwater in the city from the original manual that was all the way back to 2013 and had been slightly modified a couple of times since that point. We have looked over the last 6 months with some of the development community and as well as our internal staff on things we could do to streamline the manual, lessons learned over the last 3 or 4 years of projects that have come in under the new manual, where there are points that are either slightly confusing or could be misinterpreted, or regulations where there is a much higher like cost of compliance than there is a benefit to the component of the regulation. We had some additional, so we came up as a city, we came up with some recommendations for modifications. We worked with some of the development community to say, what would y'all think of these as approaches? And this is the engineers within the development community, not the developers themselves, but the engineering companies. Have a large group of people that Mr. Tim Keen's been bringing together to give us some commentary. They came back with a series of comments on our recommendations, as well as producing a number of additional recommendations for us to look at. So this is a quick overview, as quick as I can make it, of the topics that we are looking at and some of the potential changes. I wanted to bring these up to the committee before we get into any actual language of the manual rewrites, which is an ordinance for us. It comes through as an ordinance, to see if there were areas that y'all would like more information on. If you have a different opinion from what we're proposing, again, just try to get that discussion going. And then before we kind of drop an ordinance on your desk and ask you to vote on it. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but please do let me know if you have any questions, and I'll send them out to the committee after the meeting as well. So if you have any follow-up questions over the next few weeks, happy to talk about them. I think tentatively, based on whatever input we get from the committee, we're looking to come back over the next 2 or 3 months with actual language for how the manual would read with these revisions, which then eventually would come through as a 3-reading ordinance for consideration. First one is water quality calculation methods. I'm going to try to give a little bit of background, but not make this a 4-hour lecture, which it really could quickly become. Right now, there's what's called the traditional bathtub method. It's one way to calculate water quality under the state rules. There is a secondary method where you actually route the storm through a stormwater model. The state has been a little hesitant about that in the past, but we did get written confirmation from the state that they would allow that as a different method to demonstrate water quality. There's a lot of interest from the development community in that because it gives you a more flexible route to do calculations. We think that's a good idea. We'd revise the manual to do that. Categorized here, so I should have talked about what topic we're going to talk about in this column, what the developers and development community's input has been, the city's input, what we would potentially change in the manual, and then what kind of change would it be categorized as. So this would be increased flexibility for applicants. I think it's a good recommendation. Littoral shelf requirements. Littoral shelf is the plantings like right at the water's edge of the pond on a relatively flat shelf that sticks out in the pond that submerges sometimes. It improves water quality, keeps geese out of the ponds because they're worried about predators, and it has a number of ecological benefits for pollutant removal, as well as keeping fertilizer and things out of the ponds. Right now, they're required anytime you have more than 2 acres of property and you're installing a stormwater pond. We did get some questions saying, could we modify that to say, well, even if you're on a larger property, if you're building a very small pond, do you still need to build that shelf? Because the shelf does take up some space. We said you could consider a minimum pond size or put in some kind of tiered system where in a smaller pond, perhaps you don't need to put the littoral shelf completely around the pond, but perhaps only around a portion of the pond. So that would be a reduction of regulation. It's probably a reasonable thing to look at. Again, the shelves are great for water quality, but they do take up some space on a site. As-built record drawings. This is when you're putting together your survey at the end of the project to say, how did I build it versus how I designed it? There was a request to allow more variability from design in construction. The city has said, we think it's a good idea to allow more variability as long as the variability is to the conservative side of the design. We do allow you to go under design in the current manual as long as you remodel your work to show that it still meets the regulations. But this is a request without the remodeling, without rerunning your models for your as-built. What could you allow? So we recommend allow the ponds to be up to 10% larger without any kind of new modeling work at each basically foot of elevation of the pond. And then increase tolerances on elevation shots to 1/10 of a foot. Right now we use 100th of a foot, which is okay for rigid objects, but very hard for ground shots, some other areas. So I think that would be a worthwhile thing to do. Makes it a little easier to get through the final closeout process. Increase flexibility for applicants. Storage recovery. This is basically the state regulations say ponds have to drain out within 72 hours. There's a combination of water quality considerations there and being ready for the next large storm event to occur. So you don't basically still have water in your pond, which can be both a nuisance issue as well as a problem that if your pond is still full and you get another rainstorm, you can have flooding, even though you had a pond that would have worked if it was dry. So the city allows currently you to run a second storm instead of having your pond fully drained down to normal water elevations. The regulated communities ask, is there a different approach? Because sometimes the last little bit of water to drain out of a pond can be very challenging. We've said we think that's a good idea. Allow it to recover down to within 1/10 of a foot of normal water surface elevation. You don't have to run another storm, basically mimicking what we said in our as-built surveys. So sometimes if you have a very large pond, especially, that last little bit of water can take a really long time to drain out. It's technically a reduction of regulation, but one that I think is very reasonable. Self-cleaning velocity. There was a request that so self-cleaning velocity is the fact that when water flows through a pipe, it picks up sediment and dirt and flushes it out of the pipe into the ponds. That's part of what the ponds are for. We used to require 3 feet per second is how fast the water had to go to pick up sediment and move it. We lowered that to 2 feet per second in the most recent manual, which is a little bit more in keeping with the current literature for stormwater and the size of sediments in our area. We've also allowed it to be demonstrated in basically any type of storm event that occurs. Small storms, large storms, different types of storms create different velocities and pipe conditions. Contractors or the development engineers had asked for us to go less than 2 feet per second. We don't think that's a good idea on a standard system because the less self-clean velocity you have, the more often you have to clean the pipes with Vector trucks. We currently do struggle to get to all of our pipes in the entire city. We have hundreds of rows miles of pipes in the city. We are able to clean a lot of the grates, but not always the pipes. We certainly could consider doing this, but it would require a significant investment for the city and additional crews and Vector trucks in order to still be able to keep the level of pipe cleaning we do. So we'd recommend against reducing the self-clean velocity, but we would produce some additional guidance documentation on different ways you can comply with this, or you're allowed to pre-treat water before it gets into your pipe system, and then you don't need to meet self-clean velocity. That's what's normally done for submerged systems like on parts of Daniel Island. Permit duration, there's a request to extend the duration of our permits. Right now, we have a 5-year cap. The permits are only good for 5 years. That matches the state requirements. We would like to increase the time to start your land disturbance to 2 years from 1 year. We're currently at 1 year. If we go to 2 years, that would give some projects more flexibility. We've had a lot of projects recently with all the changes in interest rates and delay in ordering materials where they struggle to get from getting their permits to actually being in construction within a year. If we go to 2 years, it gives them a little bit more flexibility. We also want to clarify that your permits expire after 2 years of construction inactivity, 2 years of permit inactivity, or 5 years from the date of first application. If your permit expires, it just means that if we change regulations since your permit expired, you'd have to comply with the new regulations rather than being grandfathered in under the old regulations, which you would if you still had an active permit. So that's an administrative change, a little bit more in keeping with the state's requirements and our TRC rules for the city. Permit fees, developers recommended no change. The city said we think we should reduce the fees, but make them a per submission fee rather than a one-time fee, which is what we currently do. So going to a third of our current fee for non-SPA properties, half the current fee for SPA properties. This way, if you've got 3 submissions, which is not unusual for a site that's well designed to go through in 3 submissions, you'd be paying the same fee as you are now for non-SPA, and a slightly higher fee for SPA properties. Some SPA properties will take 4 or 5 submissions, so that would be a slight fee increase. Our fees are relatively reasonable. We're talking generally in the $500 to $2,000 range for most sites, so they're not extreme fees by any means, depending on the size of your site. That would create a little bit more revenue. Right now, we create maybe $125,000 of revenue a year out of these fees. They're obviously, that does not cover our cost of review for staffing, but it's a way to close that gap a little bit. And it also further encourage applicants to do a good job on submittals so that they don't continue to pay fees, which is what TRC implemented a few years ago. Submission checklist. We want to developers asked us to provide a review checklist in addition to a completeness checklist that we have now. We think that's a good idea. We're recommending we basically have the developers indicate where they've included that information and bookmark it to make sure we're getting complete applications, which would help both parties. Administrative change, good idea. Guidance on forebays and pretreatment. So when you're building stormwater ponds or underground detention systems, you basically have forebays or some type of pretreatment, depending on whether it's a pond or an underground system or some other BMP that helps remove sediment before it gets into your storage so that your sediment isn't filling up your storage. Developers ask for a little more technical guidance on different ways to do this and how the city views these, because there's different ways that different communities view these around the country. We're going to add an additional, a TPD is a technical procedure document. It's like a white paper we put out that shows how we view these. We think that's a great idea. Provide some increased flexibility. We've had some developers there's some engineers come up with some very creative ways, want to get that out to the community. 1% AEP analysis. This is AEP is the annual exceedance probability. So a 1% annual exceedance probability is a storm that has a 1% chance to occur in a given year, or what you would normally call a 100-year storm event, which again could occur multiple times in a few years, as we've seen recently, but it only has a 1% chance over any long enough time period. Developers asked for us to allow storage in calculations of offsite areas or reduction in curve number from full zoning build out. So currently, if you're building a site and it's a larger property, the city has you look at the upstream areas flowing through your property and assume that those areas are not what they are currently built as, but assume they are instead built out to whatever the current zoning is. So if you were in Cainhoy, and you're building a site and your whole upstream area is undeveloped woods, but it is zoned to be built as 4-lot per acre residential subdivision, you have to do your stormwater model as if all of that had already been built as 4-lot per acre subdivision, because there is an assumption that that's why we zoned it that way, as we expect it to be built that way. What this does is it prevents you from undersizing infrastructure in your site that prevents the upstream site from ever being able to build to its desired density or its zone density. So but it does, the way we have it modeled right now, it basically assumes there are very few stormwater requirements on those upstream properties, even though theoretically they would be subject to our current stormwater manual at the time, which would require stormwater regulation. So we agree. I think it's worth allowing the applicant to basically build into their modeling of those upstream areas some theoretical ponds to show that upstream area is meeting typical city stormwater requirements. as opposed to being extremely conservative, that there are minimal requirements for that area. That there is a little bit of a risk there that if the city in the future were to ever back off its stormwater requirements, you would limit the potential build out of those upstream properties, assuming you didn't allow flooding of the downstream properties. The city requirements did change a number of years ago to require you to make sure you're not flooding anyone downstream, and those I assume will continue in place to avoid issues like we just voted on with Barbary Woods, where upstream and downstream developments combine to flood out existing developments in between the two. But this would update the way we do these calculations to allow a theoretical pond. And we recommend doing it where you can do that or make the conservative assumption, because for many sites, the conservative assumption is not hard to meet and it is very easy to model, where the more complex modeling obviously adds in cost and effort, even though it's more accurate. So we want to give people the option to do both, since the easier method is more conservative. Under that same general topic, there was a request to not require sites under 1 acre in SPAs to do that 1% analysis. We're going to provide some guidelines for some conservative assumptions that most smaller sites use that is much easier than doing a full upstream model. And we're going to continue to allow that. Many developers do, or many development engineers do that now. We think it's a great idea. It's much easier to demonstrate compliance just by some quick conservative assumptions for smaller sites. No downstream easement or right of way. This is a challenge that right now, if you don't have any downstream easements or right of way on the, like where you're trying to discharge your water onto, the city requires you to do volume control. You basically say you can't add more water onto an adjacent property if you don't have any rights to that property. We think this is similar to properties that are like landlocked, or if you don't have a right of way on your neighbor's property, you can't drive more cars through your neighbor's property than you do now without rights from that neighboring property. So we recommend no change there. I certainly understand the concern, but there's a lot of burden on adjacent properties to be able to add water onto them without any permissions. Wetland modeling, we currently require basically wetlands to be modeled as if they were standing water, which is very conservative from a stormwater perspective. There's a request to allow them to be modeled as if they're able to hold more water during the initial rain event. This is a way you talk about this with curve numbers, with a lower curve number. We think wetlands that don't currently have standing water on them, that's a reasonable thing to do. It's technically a reduction of regulation. It's not quite as conservative, but it is probably more accurate, again, for many of the sites that do have wetlands with some ability to absorb water. So we have a combination where if you have a standing water wetland, you still treat it as standing water. If you have a wetland that is dry most of the time, you can treat it as a wetland that is dry most of the time. Submerged pipe systems. There's a request to allow submerged pipe systems. We currently do allow these. We changed that in the 2020 manual through a specific design exception process. So I think that's a good system. We've had sites come in and continue to use that system. No change there. Modeling of collection systems. There's a request to not, this is like your curb inlets, your grade inlets and parking lots. There was anything basically that's collecting water and getting it to a pond through the piping system. There's a request to not require any modeling of that, to just model the ponds, basically. We don't recommend that. A lot of the time here, the ponds stage up to the point where there is a tailwater impact on those pipes and collection systems. We do allow simplified modeling of short runs of collection system, but no modeling is pretty high risk for street flooding and for parking lot flooding. Culvert analysis. This is just some clarity on, we require a design factor of safety, assuming that large culverts like under roads will be clogged occasionally if you're building like a culvert in a canal. Just some little clarity of how that should be modeled by the design firms. We're happy to provide that update. Gutter spread, there is a request from the development engineers to allow roads to flood during rain events. We currently we follow sort of a DOT standard that you can, during a design storm, you can have up to half of a travel lane flooded. So if you're on a normal neighborhood street, you can basically flood a quarter of the street on either side from the curb, but that center half of the street can't be flooded. There can't be any water in it. This is a DOT standard to make sure you can get emergency vehicles and cars through streets without flooding them out. There was a request in development community to just allow the roads to flood. They said that roads are generally low speed, so hydroplaning wasn't a danger. However, most curbs are about 6-inch curbs, so you're getting into the risk of people flooding out their cars or having other challenges. We don't recommend that. That we think that's going to be very unpopular with neighborhoods and really provide a safety issue for both vehicle access and even emergency vehicle access. So don't recommend that change. There's only, there are 25 of these, so it will not be forever that I'm going through these, but I know it's a lot. 25-acre disturbance limit. There's a request to, right now we say you can't have more than 25 acres of your project site as bare dirt, basically. This follows some of the general guidelines in EPA and the state. There was a request to allow more than 25 acres to be unstabilized at a time. If you're building a really large project, it is certainly more efficient to be able to have the whole site as disturbed earth at the same time. There is some cost associated with having to add like temporary seeding and things in order to stabilize your site. We have recommended to not do this because a lot of our larger sites really struggle to not have sediment leave the site. We have a lot of challenges with this. We've had a number of sites that have had to go into court with us to try to address it, that they've been unable to stabilize their site. A lot of that is the nature of the rainfall we get in Charleston, where we get these incredibly aggressive pop-up thunderstorms that are just very, very hard for contractors to control that sediment through those storms. So we recommend keeping it at a 25-acre limit, even though we understand that does cause some constrictions for some of the larger project sites. Pond freeboard requirements. Freeboard basically says when you design your storm, you have to leave a little bit of space at the top of the pond that's dry to prevent your pond from overtopping your berms and failing, basically water coming out of your pond. That can happen if something settles over time, the dirt settles over time after construction, or there's damage to the edge of your pond. Number of different issues. And if you start to get water flowing out of a pond, you often get pretty quick erosion if it's an embankment that leads to a rapid pond failure. That's not always an issue for us. There are certain types of ponds that don't have that challenge, but it still provides a factor of safety for dam breach, overtopping. We only require 6 inches, half a foot for that freeboard to follow some of the state rules in that requirement. We don't recommend a change there. We think that's a good limit. Give some protection down the road if settlement occurs again or some other challenge happens. Sites less than 1 acre. There's a request to reduce review requirements. The state shifted to what's called auto coverage on sites that are up to 1 acre, where you basically fill out a form and you say that you're following the state rules, and the state automatically covers you. Says you don't have to provide any additional documentation. They don't do a detailed review of your site. We don't recommend that. The state partially has switched to that, in my opinion, because right now anyone that is an urbanized census tract has to have their own MS4 program. So almost all municipalities are already having their own stormwater regulation programs like we do under the state rules. So the state is mostly regulating more rural and suburban rural areas where you don't have the same density of development. So if you're doing a 1 acre, 1 home per acre residential housing is a lot different than running 8 townhomes per acre or something like the more typical municipal zoning. So we don't recommend this change. We think continuing with our half acre. We do even see a lot of challenges even on sites that are less than a half an acre, but you do have to draw a line somewhere, and that's currently where we tend to draw it. Reporting precision of peak water surface elevations. Basically, when you're discharging water out of your site, you have to show you're not flooding the downstream or the upstream properties. There's been a request, could you be less restrictive on how accurate that number has to be? Right now, we use 1/100th of a foot to say you are showing no impacts up to 1/100th of a foot. I think there is a reasonable request for larger sites that are a bigger portion of the watershed. The reason we don't allow increases in water surface elevation downstream, and this is one of the large changes in the 2020 manual, is that if you're in a basin where, say, there are 100 properties that all drain into the same canal, each individual property, increasing water surface elevations may not be a significant issue. But if you have 100 different people who all increase that elevation a little bit, it ends up being a pretty significant increase. So what we were saying is if your site makes up a significant portion of the watershed, so rather than there being 100 sites in the watershed, let's say there were only 10 sites or 5 sites, you would be able to make a slight increase to that water surface elevation based on how big your site is. So it gives you a little bit more freedom to make those increases, to acknowledge that you're not going to have that same challenge of cumulative impacts causing a problem. So we think that's a good idea, even though it is a slightly less conservative. SPA redevelopment versus redevelopment and valuation. This is an item that's caused some confusion. We use redevelopment in 2 different meanings in the manual, depending which section you're in. We were going to basically completely eliminate the way we use it in the SPA section, and just require all SPA sites, this is sites in areas of known flooding, that are 1 acre or larger, to reduce their runoff volume and peak runoff rates by 20% in design storms that are the 2-year, the 10-year, and the 25-year design storm. But the way we make it work for all sites, whether they're green forests currently, or whether they're completely developed parking lots, is to say we'll put a floor of good open condition land in. I mean, obviously you can't make things worse than your current site, but if you were a forest or something, you don't have to make it any better than you currently are. If you were a good open condition land, you don't have to make it any better than you currently are. If you are a completely built out parking lot with 0 stormwater controls, you're going to have to reduce the runoff volume and the peak runoff rates by that 20%. Currently, you have to reduce your peak runoff rates by 50% on all properties, whether you're a forest or not, under the current manual. That's been one of the regulations that I think has had a very high cost impact on some developments with a relatively low benefit rate. I mean, there is a benefit. There is a distinct downstream benefit to that, but I think it's one where we could back off of that number and put in a floor and still provide really good protectiveness and likely encourage more sites to redevelop or develop. So we would also continue our provision where sites under 1 acre, they don't have to make things better. They just aren't allowed to make anything worse than they currently are. And then sites under a ½ acre don't have to do modeling or calculations at all. They just use a table like we do in our current manual, where it says, if you're adding this much impervious area, you add a rain barrel or you add a rain garden. And there aren't any calculations to do basically for that. So this is a reduction of regulation, but I think one that tries to balance out keeping it reasonable for developers while still providing improvements and protections to downstream property owners, upstream property owners. Redevelopment and valuation. So this is an item that council had added to the stormwater manual a few years before we redid it, where if you do more than 50% of the value of the property and buildings on a property, you have to basically do one of 3 different choices of improvements, either reducing how much impervious area you have, reducing volume, or reducing peak flow rate. You have options, but you have to do it to your whole property, everything on your property. Where the SPA rules only apply to the areas you're actually working, disturbing land. So this whole property area, we wanted to clarify, if you're adding impervious area, you don't require infiltration testing, because we don't require you to infiltration test grass on a normal piece of property. So that makes things a little bit easier for developers, that they can change a parking lot over to grass and they don't have to prove that the grass will drain well. Just the fact that they changed it over to grass counts as meeting this requirement, or pervious pavers for that matter. We want to add a maximum extent practical type requirement for sites where you have a very large existing building footprint that you're not removing. So if you have a building, but you're not tearing down the building, saying at some point there's only so much you can do on the property without tearing down the building, because you can't find the room to do stormwater work. So this is one we're still trying to get some ideas of how to write this language, because it can be a very difficult piece of language to write, that the proof of it isn't more exhausting and expensive than the actual doing of the stormwater work. But I think it's one that'll have a lot of value. We see this a lot downtown, where if you have a building that you're not allowed to tear down or that you want to maintain, and you only have like a very narrow strip or maybe a couple parking spaces next to the building, there just isn't room to do stormwater on the site. So all you'd have to do is do as much stormwater as you could fit on the site, not fully comply with the regulation. Last one here for this redevelopment evaluation is to put a regulatory floor on valuation redevelopment, to not apply to sites that are less than half an acre in property size. So outside of LCPs, if you're less than half an acre, but you're really part of a whole complex of properties that together are 10 acres, you don't get out of this regulation. There's a whole set of rules at the state of how that works for what are called larger comp plans of development. But we think basically, again, these very small sites under half an acre, you could just say this doesn't apply at all on those sites. That would be another way to reduce the regulation between these two. There's two options there. Linear transportation projects, increased flexibility. We've had a lot of challenges when you're adding a sidewalk or you're adding a turn lane to an existing road. It's very hard to meet a lot of the stormwater requirements because you're in an existing right of way and there isn't necessarily property or room to do much more. So we would like to try to do an offset table for these, make it a little bit simpler, that you just show that you're doing something to minimize impact, because there is a lot of benefit, obviously, for many things to add sidewalks or add bike lanes or turn lanes. It wouldn't be allowed for new roads because then you do have the option to build in your stormwater as part of that new road, but it would be allowed for retrofits of an existing road. Clarifying requirements for closed system conveyance capacity is just language change, administrative language change to make sure that it's obvious it's a 4% AAP design storm. Probably not any questions on that one. And then there's been a question to allow use of reduced curve numbers and extended T sub C, which is time of concentration, which is how long it takes water to get basically to an outfall in permeable pavement. We want to provide some additional guidance documents on how to do that. Those are different design methods that often are really show that permeable pavement can be really valuable, but don't show up in traditional modeling. So we're trying to give some guidance to the development community to help them understand some ways you can use pervious pavement and make your stormwater perform better than it might appear to in a traditional model. So I know that was a lot, Mr. Chairman, but I did try to keep it relatively short.
Well, we appreciate that. I tell you what, I really do appreciate the reaching out to the engineering firms in the private sector that in a constructive way like that. I think they appreciated it too. So I know it's ongoing work, but
it is. And they definitely have the most experience of complying with the manual. We have it from the review side and we see how many different firms attempt to comply, but they see what the costs are on the development side and where their challenges are. So it's been a good conversation to have.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Fountain, looks like Councilman Parker has her hand up.
Councilwoman Parker, thank you for the help. I'm on my cell phone. Somehow I got knocked off on my desktop, so I can't see any of you. So
that's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, honestly, thank you, Mr. Fountain, for all of that information. I know that's a lot of hard work right there that we've all sort of been asking you for, I think, for a while. So thank you for all of that information. So a couple back, I don't remember which item number, but maybe second to last. So I'm just going to use a real world example rather than try to get technical. So when you have a site redeveloping, 50%, but could possibly improve traffic flow. Obviously, I had a location, where this came up, and we are regulating. They have to upfit that now to a higher degree, stormwater capacity. And so then what happens if that existing business, decides not to do it? So it's sort of like we're tripping ourselves, right? It's like, obviously we want to have that, that higher value stormwater regulation, but then we're not allowing that a business or whatever it might be to improve the traffic flow or anything like that. Am I making sense? So it didn't sound like we're changing much.
So there's a few changes there. There would be, instead of a 50% rate reduction to the area you're working in, you would only have a 20% peak rate reduction to the area you're working in. And then if you're on a site that is like if you were on a site that is currently grass or that is currently forest, you would have potentially no reduction requirement from where you are now, which would be an easier path to meet. And if you triggered the valuation redevelopment where the cost of what you were doing was so expensive that it was 50% of your property and building value, you wouldn't need to have pervious soils in order to use infiltration on, or to use reduction in impervious area on the site. So that would help many sites that have difficult soils be able to use that method to add like parking islands or some pervious pavement. So I think there certainly are some options there. There certainly is a cost associated with any regulation on a development. So you're right that there is still a cost. But what we're trying to do is identify the areas that are sort of the highest cost, or maybe you'd say the lowest, cost benefit ratio, and see if we can try to trim some of those requirements while still staying protective of stormwater. So I think that like peak rate reduction for many sites is very hard. So taking it from 50% down to 20% is a much lower standard, but I think still preserves most of the benefits that we're getting from redevelopment activity.
Okay, and then again, just to follow up quickly. So again, very non-technical. In the real world example I'm using this case, I mean, it's kind of, would that alleviate that or that particular situation, or can we consider, can the committee or can y'all consider looking at how, like, if it's a circumstance where it will help traffic flow or help the community or things like that, is there an area? Am I making sense? I know it's not very technical.
No, I hear what you're saying, Councilor Barker. I think we always have a challenge that we can't, under the way we treat stormwater rules, which are kind of like a mix between public safety and like engineering principles. We can't let you like worsen someone's flooding in order to help someone else's traffic. Like that's a balance we don't strike. We've always said you can't worsen anyone's flooding because of the safety issues basically associated with it. But we are trying to lower or make it easier to show that you're not worsening, both from a demonstration perspective as well as from what amount of engineering you have to do. So it would lower the cost of a site doing its development or redevelopment while still being protective of those properties.
Of course. Okay. So I was just sort of wondering if there's going to be, I mean, because it is gray and I understand that it's a gray area and that's what we want to try to avoid. But, that's just one. I can think of many sort of real world instances, but that's just the one I chose. But okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, the point you're raising is exactly what we're trying to do. And I think that's what Mr. Keene has really been driving, is trying to say, how do we kind of lower the cost burden on the development community for the stormwater requirements while not worsening flooding for adjacent properties and neighbors. So that is exactly what we are trying to do, is make it where more sites can do things that are beneficial to the neighborhood, beneficial to the community on their sites, more in keeping with like the city's zoning and the city's development plans, but not sacrificing kind of the protection aspects of the manual. So yeah, exactly what you're talking about is what we are trying to get accomplished.
And I think too, Councilman Parker, I mean, the goal here, and I really do appreciate Matt and his team working hard on this and all those folks from the private sector that have leaned in here. But it's also to make the process more clear and more, as black and white as it can be. And I think it's what you're looking for. And frankly, I think we all are. And so I think a lot of these efforts are to give more clarity, but also leave some authority to staff to make judgment calls as well. So,
yeah, that's a great point, Mayor. I mean, it is much easier for the city if regulations are clear and everyone is on the same page, in addition to it being much easier for the applicant engineers. So I think anything we can do to improve clarity helps everyone be more efficient and get quicker, a quicker process for review, whatever the result is on that review, which is good for, again, everybody in the long run. So that's been a real focal point, I think, of especially on the staff side of saying, hey, the more we can do to clear up any areas that are difficult or share more information that we've learned over the years of working through the manual. We've gotten a lot of good input from the development community on that. Anything on this chart that talks about like administrative changes or increased flexibility, that's what all those items are really trying to drive at, is how do we make the manual easier to use and faster for reviews.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I don't see any hands. Any other questions? Well, Mr. Fountain, you've done it again.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll be working to get over the next couple months to put together the actual language of how those will read. Well, I'll get this spreadsheet out to the committee. If anyone doesn't have any questions for me, please do reach out.
Keith, I think you're on mute.
I'm on H5. To authorization for the mayor to execute a contract amendment with JMT. Who's going to address that?
Councilmember Waring, I'll take this one. Josh Martin, good afternoon, everyone. We've been working on the Lockwood Drive seawall project, and as part of this process, we've had to look at some surveying around for existing conditions. And in talks with the U.S. Coast Guard property, which I'm showing here, they have requested that they would like to see some additional information for their needs to study any potential wave and water impacts to their facility as part of the construction of the wall. And so this $15,800 contract amendment is to amend the existing contract with JMT, who's also on the line with us today to do this work for the U.S. Coast Guard facility.
And I'd just, Mr. Chairman, if I may just move for approval for, get it to discussion point.
Second,
Properly moving second. Any more discussion?
I have a quick question, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Seeking?
Either Jim or Josh, will this slow the design of this project down at all, or is it going to all just still flow as previously anticipated?
It will not impact the schedule.
Great. Thank you. Call for the question, Mr. Chairman.
All right. All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
All right.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. Any last items to come before the committee? Well, by acclamation, we stand adjourned. Look forward to seeing all of you all tomorrow.